I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we have a very well-rounded show as ever, perhaps even more so today. So we're going to start off on the proxy fight for the soul of the Republican Party, always kind of a juicy kind of way to start things off. And we're going to likewise shift over to Rachel, who will talk about senators who didn't show up to a vaccine mandate vote. Then we're going to kind of shift over to all things European related. Will's going to talk about the latest on Ukraine, Russia, and U.S. leadership. And I will close this out on a similar note on that part of the world, talking about my recent trip to Hungary and what I saw there. But for now, let's start things off with Emily and the proxy fight for the future of the GOP.
Sure. Well, my colleagues at The Federalist reported exclusively last week that Kevin McCarthy had endorsed Liz Cheney's top primary challenger out in Wyoming. And this kicked off, or actually continued, a sort of proxy war that had once again bubbled to the surface of the sort of Republican conversation a week earlier with the legitimate discourse controversy over the RNC, which did not say that a riot, especially a riot at the Capitol, was legitimate discourse, but was taken that way by a lot of people on the center and in the media and the left. And you had, sort of the Liz Cheney wing of the party denouncing the RNC and saying January 6th was not legitimate discourse, et cetera, when of course they were talking about all of the peacefully assembled people that had nothing to do with the Capitol riot. And so now you have Kevin McCarthy jumping in late last week to actually endorse a primary challenger to Liz Cheney. It's very interesting. I saw a piece written last week in, I forget which publication it was, maybe The Bulwark, talking about how Liz Cheney is more conservative based on her voting record than Elise Stefanik, which is a really funny and interesting point to make because Elise Stefanik is somebody who does have a less conservative voting record, but has a more conservative, I would say, temperament. And it gets into this question of, and Liz Cheney, by the way, was happy to support sort of the Trump agenda until she, it may have kind of blown up her spot on the Georgetown cocktail party circuit even more than it already had, I suppose. And so this is a great question because it gets to what's happening on the right, in that if you're looking at people's votes as a litmus test and ignoring their temperament, you're ignoring something that is increasingly incredibly important. Liz Cheney's conduct on the January 6th committee is policy. It is substance. It is not somehow undone by the fact that she voted with Trump more than Elise Stefanik. If you are against the January 6th committee, you are in a substantially more conservative place than Liz Cheney. And so I think that's why Kevin McCarthy, who, by the way, is hardly like a Tea Party, Freedom Caucus Republican, wading into this war over Liz Cheney's seat in Wyoming, is a hugely interesting development. It's not unexpected. It's not unsurprising. But Liz Cheney has become a big, it's really become a proxy war. And it's interesting because it's between sort of two moderates. If you're looking at Kevin McCarthy and Liz Cheney, one of whom is more like in terms of their temperament, which is substance, conservative, and the other in terms of their temperament, which is, what do we even call it at this point? Like openly liberal, when you're weaponizing the January 6th committee in the ways that Liz Cheney has. So basically, I think it gets to this divide over whether conservatives, how the sort of intelligence state and the deep state is really the real litmus test, and sort of the political establishment. Your approach to the political establishment is the real litmus test for conservatism. And with that, I'll kick it open to the group.
So I think in many ways, this is also a proxy for Kevin McCarthy's potential speakership. And I think many Republicans are treating it that way because, as you rightly point out, there's been this attempt among some sort of establishment never Trump types to paint the acrimony toward Cheney and Kinzinger as just the Republican Party, going after people who dissent or who think differently, when in reality, it's not. It's about the fact that Cheney and Kinzinger, and Cheney in particular, are actively helping Democrats. They are actively siding with the opposition. And when you are in that position in your own party, when you are trying to subpoena your own colleagues with the intent of potentially putting them in jail if they don't comply, the best thing to do is to become a Democrat. It's not to continue to seek shelter and protection under the umbrella of the Republican Party. And so I have said in many public forums, I think even on this podcast, that I think, the censure by the RNC is absolutely appropriate here. But I think many people are watching McCarthy to see how he handles this, because again, taking out the fact that this is a rational political response to people who are trying to hurt you within your own party, I think it also is, are you going to, stand up for the majority of your conference versus the fringe of your conference? And the fringe at this point is Liz Cheney. So I think that dynamic is very out in the open right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think Liz Cheney has any room to complain. Liz Cheney decided when she was in leadership to oppose Thomas Massey's, to endorse Thomas Massey's primary opponent. Now, I mean, the tables have turned and suddenly everybody's endorsing against her. And, Thomas Massey just disagreed on policy. Liz Cheney is straight up, as Rachel points out, using the January 6th committee to subpoena her colleagues. And I think there was some reporting done that suggested that Liz Cheney was one of the primary drivers of how aggressive the January 6th committee was been, saying things like, well, they'll give us hell anyway, so we should just go all the way and be super aggressive and use our investigatory powers ruthlessly. And so in a sense, it's like, maybe it is a proxy fight for the soul of GOP, but if it is, it's one. I mean, the Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are on the wrong side. They're both going to be out of office in November. And, along with a slew of all there might be one remaining Republican who voted for impeachment. Maybe, I think Peter Meyer might be the only guy with a real shot of keeping his seat. Everybody else is either retired or is facing massively uphill odds. So, in a sense, we've won. There's a reason Bill Kristol is speaking, Bill Kristol, we got Tulsi Gabbard speaking at CPAC, but Bill Kristol actually would a hardline Democrat. Things have changed. And from my perspective, things have changed substantially for the better.
So I have a very simple point to make on Liz Cheney, which is a friendly reminder that Liz Cheney represents the state of Wyoming, which if you look in the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, if I'm not mistaken, Wyoming, I think both times, was the state with the single largest margin of victory for President Trump. It was over 40% both times. I think West Virginia was second, Oklahoma might have been third, but Wyoming, if I recall correctly, may the fact checkers in the podcast comments will call me out for it, but if I recall correctly, was literally the largest statewide margin of victory here. And, I remember, because I spent a year living in Denver, Colorado, between my Texas stint and my current Florida stint. And I remember last May doing a little weekend trip from Denver up to Cheyenne, Wyoming, which for those of you who have not been, is basically right over the Colorado-Wyoming border. It's literally 10 miles into the state of Wyoming. But this was last May, so it was just after kind of the vaxes were rolled out, the mask mandates were still in force there. And it's just it was a totally different world at the time. Colorado, blue state governance, very masked up. And I literally drive an hour, 40 minutes, very close. And I get into Wyoming, no masks anywhere, just a totally, totally different place. And I remember seeing a big billboard there saying Liz Cheney retire. So Wyoming's real America, okay? just to kind of underscore the point, put an emphasis on this. So we can do a heck of a lot better from Wyoming than Liz Cheney. It reminds me a little bit of kind of the 2014 GOP Senate primary back in Mississippi between Thad Cochran and Chris McDaniel. And I remember Chris McDaniel running all sorts of kind of primary ads, basically saying this is Mississippi, okay? We don't have to settle for second best here. So I basically agree with everything that everyone has said here. I agree with Rachel to an extent. This is just a proxy for Kevin McCarthy's future speakership. But I really just want to emphasize the point here that this is the state of Wyoming, okay? This is not a milquetoast kind of swing state. This is as bright red as it gets, and we should not have to settle for anything less than fully solid.
And the final point I'll make on this is just to reiterate what Will and Josh said, which is if this is a proxy battle, which I think it is won. And that's what I meant by pointing out that Kevin McCarthy is weighing in here. That means the sort of power has shifted to, fortunately, the right side of this proxy war. So with that, I'll toss to Josh. To Josh. and I am going to, in turn, toss it over to Rachel, actually. So we're going to do a little baton tossing exercise here.
So we're staying with the theme of Congress here. As people may have seen last week, there was another vote, the second, I believe, the Senate has taken in an effort to defund Biden's vaccine mandates. And so specifically because the Supreme Court has overturned the broader mandate, but left in place the mandate for federal workers and healthcare workers, Senator Mike Lee offered an amendment to defund that remaining part of the vaccine of Biden's vaccine mandate. Now, this is significant because this wasn't just an amendment on any bill. This is an amendment to the CR, the continuing resolution, which funds the government, for a specific period of time. So this was a must-pass bill. This was about government funding. And as anyone who's watched Congress for any length of time knows, this is where members get the highest points of leverage, right? These bills have to pass or the government shuts down. And that government shutdown is always useful for people who are demanding votes on things. So you had a vote, you had a couple of votes actually on the vaccine issue, but I want to focus on the Lee amendment in particular because a couple of things happened here. So this amendment was germane. And what that means is it was relevant to the substance of the bill. And because of that, there's an argument to be made that it should have been considered at a 51 vote majority threshold. Difference from the way a lot of the Senate handles things, which is at 60 votes, that it was considered at 51. And because of several Democratic absences, so you had several Democratic senators absent. I'm thinking of Senator Lujan in particular, who just unfortunately suffered a stroke out of New Mexico. He was still in the hospital. You had a couple other Democrats missing. You had a situation in which the Republicans, by simply the virtue of being there, had a majority, had the ability to actually outflank Democrats on this issue in a tied Senate. Now, normally when you have a tie vote in the Senate, the vice president comes and breaks that tie. Republican, the minority would lose in that situation. Republicans had an opportunity to pass this amendment. Of course, we can't ever get to talk about Republicans in the Senate without talking about looking a gift horse straight in the mouth, because that is exactly what they did. In addition to being able to pass this amendment, why would they actually want to do that? You had 4 Republicans who failed to show up for this vote, thus ensuring it failed. It failed by a party line vote of 47-46. The missing Republicans were Lindsey Graham, Mitt Romney, Richard Burr, and Jim Inhofe. Now, Richard Burr's retiring. I don't know what his excuse was. Lindsey Graham was overseas. I heard he was in Israel, and then potentially he was at this defense summit in Munich. Again, not particularly things he was elected to do, right? When you're elected, you have one job, and it's to show up and vote. Not go to defense junkets. I don't know where Romney and Inhofe were. I'm sure there's been some reporting on where they were, but where they were is almost not important to me, because again, when you are elected, you have one job, and is to show up. And Republicans, again, I cannot emphasize this enough, had an opportunity to win this vote. They had an opportunity to actually defund this part of Biden's mandate, and they didn't do it. Now, I have it on good authority from a couple of staff in the Senate, and I don't believe this has been reported, but so I guess breaking news on that front, but John Thune, who is the majority or the whip of the Republican Party, so the person in charge of counting votes, was standing in the cloakroom for several hours, and the cloakroom in either party is responsible for knowing where the senators are, waited till enough Republicans had left to tell the Democrats, okay, it's okay, you can have scheduled the vote now, you'll win and we'll lose. And this happens on a regular basis in the Senate. I call them head pats. Their votes designed to basically make it look like something is happening to satisfy a constituency without having the burden of actually making law. And it is just unconscionable to me that the Senate Republicans engaged in that tactic with this vaccine mandate. This is roiling the country. This is something that, is violating the sort of bodily integrity of, millions of Americans, not to mention the thousands of Americans that have been fired from their jobs for refusing a vaccine available for less than a year. And this is how Senate Republicans treat it, with this kind of flippancy. So I think talking about this is really important. But I guess my broader question is, what does this tell you about the state of the Senate Republicans? We've talked a lot about House Republicans on this show, but the Senate Republicans often get a pass, and I don't think that they should.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that this wasn't planned in advance, right? Either by some sort of vote canceling mechanism, maybe Jim Inhofe wanted to vote one way and Lindsey wanted to vote the other. And so they both agreed not to show up, or then some other agreement between Thune and the Democrats where, they basically, McConnell and Thune didn't want to get rid of vaccine mandates, but wanted to vote against it. So they arranged it so that they could have their cake and eat it too. They could vote against it, but ensure that the mandates are remained in place. It's a sham. I'm not sure what we do about it other than, I mean, the problem is it takes so long to replace senators. They get 6-year terms. I mean, there's a bunch of clowns. I mean, seriously, Richard Burr has been an absolute clown for the America First movement since Trump was elected. It's been a nightmare. I mean, I just remember him, subpoenaing Donald Trump Jr. and being really hardcore about that subpoena, the president's son, and he's just, going after him of his own party. And Burr, then also the insider trading stuff with Burr seemed particularly aggressive about that. And yet for some reason he didn't lose his committee assignments. Strange. Senate Republican, Mitch McConnell is very talented and very good at certain things, like getting judges confirmed, but it's very clear he's not very much on the national conservative side, and also not with the base. And it sucks, and we need to figure out a way to hold senators' feet to the fire a little better. And I'm not actually sure what that is.
Yeah, I feel like this has just been the never dying recurring conversation that we've had ever since I started to get more involved in campaigns and politics and all that stuff, maybe during the Tea Party era, 10, 12 years ago or so. And, Rachel's obviously been at the forefront of this movement, right? Trying to recruit better candidates and do primary challenges. And we back when Jim DeMint was running Senate Conservatives Fund, obviously we had a lot of those primary challenges, and we still obviously are trying to do that through other mechanisms as well here. But it's a problem that I think for institutional reasons will probably never truly go away, obviously. I mean, the best that we can possibly do is try to mitigate it and just try to fight kind of ad hoc one-off battles and try to win where we possibly can and get more kind of NatCon, America First, pro-America, whatever words you want to use, kind of candidates across the spectrum there. One thing that I kind of want to add, so around the same time that this was happening, there was a very interesting opinion out of the court that I clerked on, the Fifth Circuit. It was 3 Republican nominees. It was Jennifer Elrod, who is a George W. Bush nominee. It was Andy Oldham, a Trump nominee, and Jerry Smith, who, along with Edith Jones, is kind of the 2 kind of Reagan lions of the court. And the case was a United Airlines vax mandate case. Long story short, I'll cut to the chase here. The court sides 2-1 on the good side, basically staying the vax mandates with Elrod and Oldham in the majority. Judge Smith, who I personally know Judge Smith, he used to listen to Rush Limbaugh in his chambers every single day when Rush was alive. So he definitely is a movement conservative for the past half century, wrote a blistering dissent, an unusually personal dissent, actually, on kind of the opposite side of this issue here. I kind of have to wonder whether there's just a generational gap, honestly. That's kind of where I'm getting here. We're looking at Inhofe and these kind of older Republicans kind of look side by side around the same time that Jerry Smith was writing this dissent. It just seems to be kind of a generational disconnect on this issue. And I think the boomer cons really just fundamentally don't realize the way that the vaccine mandates are being used to subjugate young deplorables, young America First people. I think this is just a genuine failure to understand that.
And also, I think a greater concern. I think I've noticed that generally that older Republicans, I've talked to my parents about it, or just generally people who are over 70, they are a lot more scared of COVID, and they have a reason to. I think less so now, but you get this. They were much more serious about it. And I mean, I even have a long-term thesis that Trump's lack of seriousness with regard to COVID actually cost him the election in 2020, because if you looked at the numbers, he just lost old white people, which is a voting block he should never lose, right, as a Republican, but he lost a bunch of them. So I guess that's sort of on this issue. That I wouldn't be surprised if that's exactly what we're dealing with in the Senate. A lot of old white men.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad theory at all. And we could relitigate 2020, but I actually agree with Will that was a huge part of it. And basically whatever Rachel says, I just assume is true because I lack the
evergreen sentiment, by the way.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't know sometimes. But when, you get her talking about certain things and I'm like, Rachel, please. This is America, not the Soviet Union. Especially. Okay. But in this case, the procedural stuff is often exploited by members and their staff to shield them. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if that was part of this, if age was part of this. But it does speak to an interesting failure on the part of the Republican Party to coalesce around something that is just so plainly obvious. I think that's always been a problem with COVID. Even going back, like South Dakota Republicans will tell you that they actually stopped Kristi Noem from shutting things down early. It's not as though any of this has been easy, but we're 2 years into it. We should, like people who are thinking clearly on this should have a more unified front. So on that, by this point, we can transition to the next segment.
Sure. So I wanted to talk about Ukraine and Russia, and I guess I wanted to make a couple points that I haven't seen like out there a lot. The first is we have this sort of bizarre insistence that war with Ukraine or Russia, Putin has made a decision to invade and he's going to do it tomorrow. And that's like are breathlessly repeated by both like mainstream news outlets and even by like government officials. And it just strikes me that obvious, that's very strange to also be saying that while also claiming that Putin is a master of deception and misinformation, right? Like why do we assume we know Putin's mind? You guys are sure he's going to invade tomorrow? Really? Do we know that? It seems like he hasn't yet. I have a basic thesis that somebody made the point that what Putin's able to do by putting 150,000 troops on the border is essentially makes Ukraine's situation just totally untenable. And so extract concessions because you can't have a functioning economy in a world where like people are threatening to invade you. They're not going to invest. So instead we've got like very, very serious bullying, but like the threat of invasion seems low. And so, the fact that we had, I think maybe a week ago or so, you had the Ukrainian president being like, stop claiming that war isn't coming immediately. Whereas, we still had Biden and Russia and the Americans be like, no, you're going to get invaded tomorrow. So I think that's strange. And I think that the second thing that really is strange to me is we have this bizarre situation where because we had actual leverage over Putin with the Nord Stream pipeline that Trump had sanctioned, and that somebody made a very interesting point. It's not just that the Nord Stream pipeline prevented Russia from making money off of natural gas. It meant that it relied on the pipelines through Ukraine, so it couldn't turn Ukraine into a battleground. Because it's not safe to do that. You'd be jeopardizing all your energy sales. But we let this pipeline go through at the behest of Germany, and now basically one, Germany's in Putin's pocket because they're not going to oppose it. Two, there's nothing stopping him from invading Ukraine, and all of a sudden everybody's getting like, now we're trying to like get in the way and stop any further incursion into Ukraine. Like our American policy on this just doesn't make much sense. And then finally, this sort of like, I would like American policy on Ukraine to make sense, but I also am not in the position where I think we have any business intervening in Ukraine. It's just wildly outside of our sphere of influence. And I saw people like David French being like, you're crazy if you think Canada is more important than Ukraine, or what's going on in Canada is more important than Ukraine. I'm like, really? We share a 3,000 mile long border with Canada. They're our northern neighbor, and what's being done by Trudeau, like Trudeau and Biden have affinity. And so what's being done to conservatives in Canada is very much of concern to conservatives in the United States. So the fact that David French is like completely alienated from those basic concerns, that American conservatives have, and is still like obsessed with, a border dispute 5,000 miles away is just kind of shocking to me. And so, I realize that like national conservatives is sort of a, broader movement with like a bunch of European constituents, and that Ukraine has certainly much more direct influence, relevance to their interests. But in terms of the United States interests, I actually don't see a substantial, other than trying, we'd like to deter it. We want to maintain an order of sovereign states. We should go back to sanctioning the Nord Stream pipeline and try and deter it with that sort of means. But I don't get the sort of, this idea that Biden should like go aggressively confront Putin and that we might actually have, a military confrontation. It sounds like a terrible idea. Anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about there.
All right, so a few quick points. I definitely agree with Will's take basically, but just a few things to kind of emphasize or also to add to the conversation here. So just want to emphasize the Nord Stream 2 point here. It is ludicrous. It is absolutely ludicrous that senile Joe Biden is now beating the war drums on Vladimir Putin basically a half year after he just completely caved on Nord Stream 2 to Putin. I mean, I wrote that column at the time. He was talking with Germany. They kind of at the very last minute, the Biden State Department kind of just immediately kind of caved in there. They gave Vladimir Putin exactly what he wanted on Nord Stream 2. The way to fight back against Putin is not necessarily by sending troops there. It is by lots of kind of softer measures. Okay, the Trump administration put back missile defense, in Poland and Czech Republic and our allies in Central and Eastern Europe, which the Obama administration had taken out. The way to kind of push back was through kind of petroleum. That's kind of obviously the mother's milk of the current Russian Federation, and Nord Stream 2 was the exact vehicle to do that. So it's just nuts, frankly. And I'm cynical enough where I basically think this entire thing is effectively a way for Biden to try to just distract from obviously all of his kind of sundry domestic woes, obviously with inflation reaching kind of 40-year highs, everything else going on, Afghanistan, obviously. So that's really what I think is ultimately going on here. Just a couple of other things to note. Germany, because of Nord Stream 2 and for other kind of historical reasons, which are probably a little murkier, Germany is effectively ambivalent, the best that I can tell, on what happens between Russia and Ukraine. They genuinely do not seem to care at best. At quote unquote worst, they probably are rooting for Putin to just do whatever he wants because they are that reliant on Russia. If Germany, which is by far the most economically important country in the European Union, is ambivalent and does not care, I fail to see any reason whatsoever why I should give a you-know-what about what Vladimir Putin does in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And just a couple other quick things to note here. This narrative that liberal democracy is on the line between big thuggish authoritarian Putin, who obviously is a thug. Okay, he's ex-KGB. He definitely, he murders political opponents. This is not a good man. Okay, like I'm not trying to downplay that, but the notion that like Ukraine can be juxtaposed as some bastion of liberal democracy is completely farcical. Ukraine is just as, if not more, corrupt and oligarchic a country as Russia is. President Zelensky there, I genuinely think, based on what I've read and what I've heard, probably fears for his life on most days because the oligarchs there actually have that much power if he missteps. This is not a friendly place. It is not kind of a bastion of liberal democracy, obviously. And just like a final note, and we'll get to this in the next segment, even some people on the ground there in the region are not necessarily involved. I mean, Hungary, which shares a border with Ukraine, Hungary and Ukraine have deeply frosty relations right now because of the way Ukraine treats the ethnic Hungarian minority in Western Ukraine. So this narrative of the David French kind of good versus evil binary is just totally false. It's grotesque misinformation, honestly.
Yeah, I don't have a ton more to add. I do think that Josh's point about, and Will's point, obviously, about Nord Stream is critical here. And it's like grossly and criminally underreported in all of this, right? Like the fact that we spent 4 years saying Trump was a Russian asset when he was effectively more aggressive on this point against Russia than Joe Biden is here. And we aren't even talking about that fact. We aren't even talking about the fact that our critical deterrence measure was taken off the table. But, I've sort of stayed a little bit out of these arguments because I don't feel like I have the best grasp of all the competing sort of narratives going on here, but I'm also wondering if that's kind of the point. I think there's a tremendous amount of gaslighting going on right now from the media, from Joe Biden, from sort of people, and this is always how wars begin, right? Is that they tell you your hair must be on fire. They tell you that everything's at stake, that like it is vital. You aren't patriotic if you don't care about this border that is thousands of miles away from you. And it's very difficult for me to get worked up about Russia, a dying petrostate, when China exists. And that's basically kind of my not informed take on this whole thing.
Russia is Saudi Arabia with caviar. Like,
yeah.
it's not,
except less relevant.
And vodka. Like, what other than caviar and vodka, what do you buy that's made in Russia? Like, nothing.
My colleague, John Daniel Davidson, sent a screenshot of the New York Times homepage around this morning, and it was just plastered with a million different angles about why Ukraine is the biggest news in the world right now. And it is very interesting because it's basically projecting exactly the concerns of our military and of our Department of Defense, which, again, like, you're the New York Times. Like, do you not have better judgment than saying that all the news that's fit to print on your front page is just like basically just every single different angle on the Ukraine issue? And I think there's something between there's something very much between "we are all Ukraine," which was just a disgustingly sanctimonious and wrong sentiment, and "nobody cares," because there are, people have legitimate reasons to want the United States to be a leader. The more that I think about it, the more I realize it is technologically impossible to sort of disentangle ourselves and remain a safe country and protect our borders and protect our people. It's sort of impossible just to do that in a nuclear world in a way that it might feel sort of like we could counterbalance all of our silly binary behavior over the course of the last 50 or so years. But I think it's important for in the sort of conservatives finding the position between maybe Sohrab and Lindsey Graham to maybe realign our I guess our philosophy, our basic philosophy on who the foreign policy serves. And this is a great test. Taiwan is a great test of that question. And I hope that we're arriving at a better solution. But I'm not sure that what we've arrived at yet is exactly it. I'll just close by saying I think what everybody said in this segment is absolutely true, that the sort of binary being depicted by the media does no service to the American people. It is misinformation, and it's not helping anything.
Okay, so let's stay in that general region, Central and Eastern Europe, I guess. And I just want to close out by doing what I guess might be a somewhat self-aggrandizing segment, but it is about a topic that has come up a few times on this podcast and is kind of getting an outsized attention, if you will, on the current American conservative discourses. And that's the nation state of Hungary, which is a relatively small state. About 10 million people live there. Formerly used to be a lot bigger, obviously, kind of at the height of the Austro-Hungarian Empire back when Vienna and Budapest, I think, had kind of outsized power in the world. But anyway, so I was just there, okay, if is where this is going. I was just there. I spent 4 or 5 days there last week. I flew over for a conference that MCC, which is kind of a university there in Budapest, put on. There were a lot of Americans over there. Heather McDonald from Manhattan Institute was there. Rod Dreher, who's kind of on and off there for the past year or so. Our friend Gladden Papin was there from American Affairs. Jeremy Carl, Claremont. So a lot of Americans flew in for this. So as I'm sure we've talked on this podcast numerous times, and as the no doubt astute listeners of this podcast are also aware, Hungary's kind of gotten some like outsized attention in American conservative circles, right? The New York Times, they did this long piece back in October about the new right. It was disproportionately focused on Hungary. I think Rod Dreher himself had like his name was cited like 30 times in that article or something like that. But this is my first time over there. I'd never been to the country, and I got really, really, really lucky. Literally on my layover in Munich, Germany, on the way over there, I got a very last-minute email saying, you're in a small group, me and the prime minister, in 2 hours. So I had to like frantically go to the airport in Budapest, change out of my sweatpants and hoodie into like something moderately respectable. And got to meet Prime Minister Orban, who's gotten in, he gets all sorts of flack. People in the Western media, the New York Times, Washington Post, they call him a thuggish dictator, authoritarian, fascist, all the normal terms there. And it's because he's been in power now for about 10 to 12 years. I think he got back to power in 2010. And his party, Fidesz, is an undoubtedly conservative party, along with Law and Justice, which is Prime Minister Morawiecki's party in Poland, is really kind of one of the two truly kind of NatCon, national conservative parties currently in power in Europe. There are all sorts of other kind of NatCon-y parties in Europe. There's, there's Vox in Spain, there's La Liga in Italy, and lots of kind of other smaller parties, certainly in the UK as well, of course. But I kind of saw this for myself. And when I got there, we stood around. We literally were standing for like 2 hours. There were like 20 of us with Prime Minister Orban and his kind of political director, Balázs Orban. They're not related. And I got to hear this man talk. And first of all, he's like laugh out loud funny. Like literally, I was like laughing. He has a real sense of humor, very outgoing, very casual. He was wearing like dad jeans kind of and like took our questions, handled them quite well. And the country is nothing like what the media depicts it as, based on everything that I saw there. You kind of hear that he's anti-Semitic because he talks a lot about kind of Hungary's Christian heritage, and kind of Christianity infuses kind of the polity. Marriage is robustly publicly defended. There is union of one man and one woman. Religious schools get all sorts of kind of preference in the education. But the notion that this country is anti-Semitic, I personally saw is utterly insane. The Jewish community there is actually quite thriving. I personally visited numerous synagogues. I ate in a kosher restaurant. The government is, if anything, deeply philo-Semitic. It is public that our Edmund Burke Foundation colleague Yoram Hazony is quite friendly with Prime Minister Orban. Former Prime Minister Netanyahu said that Orban was his greatest ally at the United Nations. So this narrative is just totally nonsense there. And more generally speaking, what I was really kind of taken aback, because this is NatCon Squad, this is the home for national conservatism. Balázs Orbán, Prime Minister Orbán's, again, his political director, literally said, and this is basically verbatim, in this meeting in Carmelita, the Prime Minister's residence in Budapest, he basically said verbatim, this is a national conservative government. He literally used the phrase national conservatism. And we talked about what that looks like there. And it talks about fundamentally kind of rejecting the lie of values neutral, liberal neutrality. That is fundamentally what Prime Minister Orbán is about. He says over and over again in our meeting how the state does not exist to purely be neutral between compelling matters of cultural inheritance and civilizational sanity. So, to take one obvious example there, gender ideology, transgender, even homosexuality is just completely kept out of K through 12 schools. They are not going to be neutral and say like teachers can do what they want. So they're putting their thumb on this scale, I think, in a way that kind of national conservatives and kind of our friends at the post-liberal order Substack ought to be quite proud of. But I'll kind of get off my soapbox. I was quite happy with what I saw there. It kind of affirmed a lot of what I had heard from Rod Dreher and our other friends. But just want to emphasize that the media narrative about Hungary, I think, is quite literally insane. And I would definitely encourage those who are able to make the trek over there to see it for themselves.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of Hungary. I want to go over there when I get a chance. I think one point is that, basically the left has tried to make it so that any criticism of George Soros is anti-Semitic. Like that's the entire meme. And that's why apparently, so clearly Soros and Orban don't like each other very much. Soros wants to see Orban out of power, but Orban wanting Soros's influence in Hungary diminished is anti-Semitic. No, that's not true. We just, I don't like the fact that George Soros has funded a bunch of unbelievably wacko progressive prosecutors in the United States to take over district attorneys' offices and make our country less safe. That's not an objection to him rooted in his religion. It's an objection to his political activity. And so I think it's absolutely ridiculous. And it's also the sort of objection of anti-Semitism. It ends up just being a weapon, right? Like the way that the left uses it, they're not even remotely concerned about the welfare of Jews as a general matter. There's a reason they're so hysterically anti-Israel and why they completely whitewash crime against Jews in American cities. Instead, it's like, this is just a weapon to tar their political opponents and make them, beyond the pale. But it's not going to work anymore, I don't think.
It's been interesting to watch conservatives look at, especially some sort of like national conservatives look at Hungary and even just pick up, I think, some smaller things from what happens, like smaller things about culture. I mean, we've talked on the show before about like architecture and family policy, and there are things that you can do without, taking over the entire federal government and expanding the bureaucracy, et cetera, that would make this country a healthier and happier and better place. And so I actually think that it's worth studying a lot of that and saying, as we reconfigure, just sort of like what we were talking about in the Russia segment, how are we serving our country? How are we putting our country first, our people first, and not, any of these special interests or corporate America, or how are we putting corporations first? How are we putting Raytheon first? But sort of bringing us back to, this is a huge country. It's absolutely massive geographically, huge population, extremely extremely diverse population. I don't know if any society this big and this diverse has ever existed with this level of harmony, even though it doesn't feel like it sometimes relative to other societies. It certainly is a remarkable achievement. But then also saying, okay, but how do we actually have something cohesive? How can we have a cohesive national project? I think it's heartening to see people trying to learn on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with that take, because I'm always skeptical of the sort of one for one conflation, like they're doing it and it's working, so we should do it and it's working. And to Emily's point, like this is just a totally different kind of country, and the founding was to explicitly reject that idea that, we can take the old world and make it work in the new. But there are obviously things that you can learn from policies abroad. And I think in this case, as Emily points out, the Hungarian experiment in many ways is this idea of a paradigm toward policy in which the nation is paramount, right? That you're thinking about what is best for the country, our people, our society. And we don't often think that way anymore in our policymaking. We think very short term, we think very sort of one-off, sort of crisis to crisis. And that sort of long-term thinking is missing from how we do a lot of things. And I think we could benefit, a lot from adopting, at least, to try and view our proposals through a paradigm. Like what Hungary has. If you want to build a long-term sustainable society, you have to actually start thinking about your policymaking through that lens.
Yeah, I mean, the general paradigm is one of national and cultural inheritance, and frankly, just to use kind of a somewhat overwrought term in our current discourse, but it is in the teaser of this very podcast, ultimately for the common good itself. Okay, I mean, that's really what they're concerned about, is not kind of indulging various kind of idiosyncratic individual kind of hot takes, but really just for the common good of the whole. But let's transition over to final thoughts. Who wants to get us started?
I can start. I think that's actually a good place to start final thoughts. In that we do talk about this a lot, but I actually think it's the common thread through pretty much everything that we talked about this week. In that Josh's point about Liz Cheney is an important one. She represents Wyoming. What is best for the people of Wyoming? What do the people of Wyoming want in a representative? Obviously, they elected her when she was, I would say, a very different politician. They probably could have predicted, maybe if they could have possibly predicted how much crazier politics would get, maybe they could have predicted that she wouldn't be super strong on those issues. But I would say they elected her when she was a different politician. So how do things how does everything that the conservative movement and the Republican Party focuses on benefit the people, benefit the nation? Corporate America increasingly has literally no interest in how its activities benefit America. They are open about this. Companies like Nike are open about this. It is about what benefits their bottom line. And that doesn't matter if it helps China's national interest at the expense of the United States' national interest. And so, when we're talking in these Cold War terms about Ukraine and Russia, well, what is the American people's interest here? Explain that to us. Don't tell me we are all Ukraine because of some BS that does not apply in 2022. Tell me why the American people should care about it, and I will happily listen. Why it benefits them, not why they should care for some abstract reason, but why it actually benefits them, why it's good for the country. And I think that's sort of abstract in and of itself, but it will help conservative politicians and even politicians. I mean, you see Tulsi Gabbard do this. Politicians in general immensely, and it's very telling that they haven't spoken in those terms for a long time.
Yeah, I think that.
Sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
My final thought was going to be to return to my extreme normie takes on Ukraine and Russia, but I think that's kind of it, because I think I am. I've not talked about a lot of Ukraine and Russia stuff because I just don't feel as informed about it as I do about other topics. But I think that I am the populace in that sense. No one has made a compelling argument to me about why, I should, in my small brain, devote even my limited resources to caring about what's going on over there. And I think that is something that needs explanation, because again, we've come up in this foreign policy universe, especially when it relates to Europe, being like, oh, well, this is why NATO exists. Okay, well, if this is why NATO exists, then why are we the ones sort of throwing ourselves in front of everything? Where's NATO? Why does it matter or that Germany doesn't care when they're a NATO partner, when all of Europe, stands to be tangibly more harmed, I would argue, by what's going on in Ukraine. And yet we are the ones that are sort of subjecting ourselves to sort of all the flagellation about it. Like, someone please, again, I am the normie here in this argument. Like, someone please tell me again, why, when China exists, I should care about what is happening there. And I don't mean that in a callous way, right? Like, obviously what's going on, with the people of Ukraine and everything that could happen there is that's terrible, right? But as a matter of national interest, someone should explain to me why our limited blood and treasure, our limited bandwidth for all these issues should be directed toward Ukraine. I am the normie waiting for someone to rescue me from my normiehood.
Right. Well, I don't think it exists. Like, I thought about this tweet. Alyssa Farah tweeted this morning. She said, I speak a lot about the dangers of America's political divide. I usually use the example that I don't think Americans could currently come together around a common cause like we did in World War II. The Ukraine-Russia situation may sadly stress test that theory. I want to be like, you do recall that Japan and Germany declared war on the United States, right? Both of them. Japan struck Pearl Harbor, killed thousands of Americans, and destroyed the primary naval base of the United States in the Pacific. And then Germany just followed up and just declared war on us and said, okay, that's a little different, I think, than a border dispute in Eastern Ukraine. It's just substantially different. And it's like it's almost like there's a school of these weird kind of neoconservative foreign policy hacks who just assume the premise, right? Or they assume the conclusion that obviously we have an enormous foreign policy interest in what happens in the Donbass. It's like, no, I don't think that's obvious in the slightest. You need to explain it to us, and they don't even bother. And it's I think that would be my final.
Yeah. By the way, to that point, when the State Department spokesman was pressed on this, right, when he actually was asked by an AP News reporter to explain, he basically just fell all over himself, not being able to. So there's your answer in part.
Yeah, so I mean, just like two quick things. We've kind of mentioned these earlier, but just kind of emphasize here in closing thoughts, because we're all kind of talking about Russia, Ukraine, and obviously is kind of the story of the week, of the month, or whatever. I said this earlier, but I really genuinely think that this is basically, it's very straightforward from my perspective. Again, inflation is at 40-year high. Democrats are going to get slaughtered this term. All the relevant polls are showing kind of that the Republicans might be poised to take kind of their biggest congressional majority since the Calvin Coolidge era in the 1920s here. Joe Biden is an old man, okay? He is in his late 70s. He came of political age during the Cold War. So when you need someone to pick on, who are you going to pick on other than the ex-KGB guy? You're going to pick on Vladimir Putin. I mean, if you want like a nice distraction, I really think it's that simple. I mean, I think there's possibly something out there that we don't know yet. It's possible that someone has something over his head. I saw it was either Lee Smith or Tony Bedron. I think it was Lee Smith had kind of an essay at Tablet magazine a few weeks ago, basically speculating as to this very exact point. Maybe we'll eventually see. But the final thing that I want to say before we wrap up the show is I think Rachel's professed quote unquote normie-con take is actually exactly right in this particular situation, which is this is just obviously at the end of the day a massive distraction from China. Okay, when I was over in Hungary, I gave a few interviews to kind of local Hungarian media, and one of them kind of asked me from like an American perspective, what are your top foreign policy concerns? And I said, okay, number one is China, number two is China, 3, 4, and 5 are all China. Is China. Okay, that is the issue of our time. We are not quite yet maybe in a new Cold War, but it's entirely possible that we're heading there. That is the threat. That is the issue of our time from a geopolitical perspective. Now, I think some people from kind of an older generation kind of think about that and they say, oh, well, when we just kind of capitulate all around the world, we're just going to kind of embolden Xi Jinping. And to an extent, that's maybe true, but I would submit a countervailing thought as well, which is to the extent that we spread the global American empire in this late stage republic increasingly thinner and thinner all around the world with, pardon my language, but these half-assed troop commitments, okay? And we're basically not even enunciating what the clearly articulated national interest is in a given region. And there are troops there that they don't really even know what they're fighting for. We're probably not going to win. It's going to end in a slightly slower, but nonetheless still humiliating failure. That, I think, more so than the former is what really kind of incentivizes Xi Jinping to kind of, go ham basically in Taiwan and the South China Sea. But I will kind of get off my soapbox on that note. So on behalf of Will, Emily, and Rachel, I'm Josh Hammer. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.